In today's podcast of Data for All, Data in Democracy. Welcome to the Data for All podcast. I'm Charlie Yielding.
And I'm Charlie Apigian, where we want to empower you to think different with data.
And in today's podcast, we get to explore the subject of how democracy creates and uses data with Dan Bouk, author of the book Democracy's Data, The Hidden Stories of the U.S. Census and How to Read Them, and how our days became numbered, risk and the rise of the statistical individual.
Yes, and this is really exciting for me because, first of all, if you've listened to this podcast, you know I play with community level data all the time. And to bring somebody on that has dived into it like Dan has is just going to absolutely... I'm sorry, Charlie. I'm going to get so excited.
No, that's fair. Yeah. My only question is, do you try to break each character limit from the previous book's title? So is the next book title going to be even longer?
It's possible. Like in the 19th century, they used to do it such that it would be like Democracy's Data, how the hidden numbers in the U.S. Census, or how it is that we understand what the population is and the way it should be apportioned, its political titles, and thinking about individual stories. And it would go on for like the full title page would just be covered in text. So that's my aspiration.
Well, but before we get into that, I want to make a huge shout out to Dan because we just spent 30 minutes trying to figure out our tech. And we've decided it has a new name. It's Sassy Software. And Charlie and I wanted to be together in person, and so I could touch and get mad at him when I need to. And to figure that out, Dan has been incredibly generous with his time this morning. So thank you, Dan, for that. And Charlie, I just want to learn more about Dan.
Yeah. So Dan, you're also somebody that I like to call a fancy pants. So other Charlie here's a fancy pants. You're fancy pants. You have a PhD. You do academic stuff. You write books and things like that. And so before we get into like your most recent book, just tell us about yourself and then give us a little bit about like how you even got into being. And I say this as a term of endearment, such a nerd.
Such a nerd.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate the fancy pants acknowledgement. I do have to, I don't want to like blow your mind though, but I'm actually wearing shorts right now.
Okay.
So no one can tell.
Fancy shorts. But it is.
Fancy shorts.
Post-pandemic, nobody is judging at all.
I should have just gone with sweatpants. Mm. All right. It's very warm here in Northern Manhattan. So I'm coming to you from Northern Manhattan, where luckily most of the end of world haze has mostly drifted away.
Oh, that's right. From Canada first down to you all, and then
this is the world we built for ourselves here. I got my undergraduate degree in mathematics, and I love math and numbers, but I've also always just been drawn to story, to literature, to trying to understand how people tick, how our society works. And so I was often really interested in these questions, particularly of how we use mathematical models, data systems to try to build ways of understanding how the world works. And so that first book you talk about how our days became numbered is about life insurance.
Yeah.
Which was a topic I didn't expect to come to, but I came to understand was actually really important for shaping the way we think about who people are, how people count, and in particular, like how we think about people as part of like a statistical framework, in a statistical framework.
Right.
And then this new book got me involved in thinking about, as Charlie was saying, like the most important public data source, which is the census, which is remarkable because it serves so many incredible purposes and it's like foundational to how our democracy works. And also, not incidentally, is entirely open and public. So we actually know how it works, unlike all the other big data systems that we encounter all the time.
Yeah, very true. The original big large language model or large data set goes back many years on that.
So I'm going to go ahead and confess my ignorance. I had no idea the census was so broad. Like I thought it was just like 5 people lived here. You declare head of household, and then that's it.
Oh.
But then to find that you can literally tell stories with the data you pull out of there, because that's like we talk about data storytelling as it applies to like generating action and things like that. But you're generating stories from data that are history, which I guess is how it works.
Yeah.
But I never thought about it like that.
No, and your conception is entirely forgivable and understandable, because indeed most people, when they fill out a census, well, they never remember that they fill out a census, because it's the most unmemorable thing that ever happens. When you do it these days, you answer probably at most like 10 questions per person in your house, and for most it's fewer than that. So yeah, it doesn't feel like you're necessarily doing a whole lot for most people who are doing it these days.
Yeah, and so let's lead up to that. So what were you like as a kid? Why did you become a math major in the first place? I'm not letting that go, because again, what we talk a lot about on here is everybody's journey to becoming data, whatever they are, whether it's data science, data literacy, data curious, is different. And so, you decided to be a math major. Was that because your dad told you to, or was it a love that you found early on?
I mean, so one can tell the story as my parents, brought this fate upon me, because my father did image science for Kodak, and would then, whenever I asked him a question about math or science, would then give me an answer, which I think was primarily meant to try to convince me to never again ask a question, because it was going to be so thorough that it would scare me away. And then my mother, when I was in middle school, went back to school, finished up her bachelor's degree and then a master's degree, and then started teaching at English literature and composition at our community college. And so they kind of I feel like I was very well versed on both sides, as we kind of think of them, of the humanities and the sciences. And then the math was an easy choice, because I went to Michigan State, and it was the science that had the fewest requirements.
Oh, there you go.
And therefore I thought I could keep my options open.
I didn't know the Michigan State part. I'm from basically Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Fellow Michigan folks.
Yes, for sure.
That's right.
And Spartans, well, we don't acknowledge them really. So it's they're not really you know how that whole thing works about. But in going into then further education, like you said, you went into more of the story side of it, or the history side of it. So that led to where you are today. What was math to what, and then what are you teaching these days, or what's the day job?
Right. So I teach history at Colgate University. This is a method of laundering myself into the history department because I had a degree in mathematics. The history of science is kind of like a bridge that allows one to move from being focused on the sciences to trying to become someone who also does history. And so I am interested in these questions about science as a political, social, cultural project, right? So for me, it's not just that science tells us true things about the world, although it often does. The story of how we, as a culture, people, political society, come to create modes of doing science, come to create data sets, those themselves, I consider to be worthy stories to tell. These are, in the same way you could imagine someone writing a book about a famous poet, or writing or thinking about how a novelist does their work. Yeah, I think that way about data makers and about scientists, about the Census Bureau.
Yeah, that you do. I think in the democracies data, you do a really good job of painting the picture of people in situations that have perspectives that lead to the decisions of what is or is not included. And we can get more into that later, because the several parts of the book had pieces that through my own data journey I've had to deal with. What do you do with other when other is 30% of your responses. Like you've got to break it out even. Either you're not done basically, but if you've got limited space, which I didn't have to deal with that same thing, then what do you do? And I can see how it can get highly contested.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let's start at the beginning of like I love this idea of studying the people that make the data basically, and because of that, I keep noticing or talking about the fact that because we can't collect good data, it actually changes our way of living, right? Our allocation of funds, throughout the United States. And the census is the perfect example of that. But before we do that, I'd love to hear your perspective on what is data, since you have really studied it. And so when you hear the word data, what is it that comes to your mind? What is your perspective?
So listeners can imagine a doorstep, and there's a person on one side, they're knocking on the door, and then somebody else opens it, and they're coming together, and one of those people is holding a piece of paper. It's got a bunch of questions on it. And that nexus, that interface is for me like the vision that I want at the center of anyone who's thinking about like, what is a data set or what does data mean? Because you can think about the kind of entire process as that is like the central point. Because here you've got, no matter what's happening, whether you're on a web form, whether you're answering a survey, there's some set of questions that somebody somewhere set out as like, these are the things we think we want to know. Mm-hmm. And then there's this process of trying to interpret it to get the world, with that person on the other side of the doorstep, to fit into those forms. And somebody's got to do that work. That somebody might be a real person, that somebody might be the person answering the questions themselves, who's trying to figure out like, which one of these applies to me? That somebody could be like a sensor, a mechanical sensor, or an AI system trying to figure out how to, they're going to try and take the real world, stuff it into those existing acceptable categories, and then send that all off somewhere else, away from the doorstep, where there's going to be these processes of the people who go and say like, oh, now how do we make sense of this? Take this like wild and crazy world and refit it back into what we consider to be acceptable set of categories, so that we can then generate something like reliable numbers, which won't be a perfect depiction of the world, right? Just as no written description is a perfect description of the world, but it'll provide us some new and interesting way, and hopefully a useful way of seeing that world outside of us.
Yeah, and Charlie, I want to just sit here and elbow him now because he knows how much I love this. What you said is just, that pivotal point of you're trying to capture what's happening inside that home, and you're doing your best with the questions or what you think is the best way to capture it, and that's the data that you're getting, and that's what data is, right? It's just trying to capture whatever reality you see at that moment, and it's the best that you can do with the tools that you have. And you saying it's not perfect, it's literally, what I say is the worst part and the beauty of data is that it's not perfect. And when we start to embrace that, we can make better decisions because, it's a way to enhance our decisions as opposed to be the decision, right? And so, I'm 100% with you on that.
Yeah, you were hit like it's a really great analogy, but it hits on the same premise. It's like it's the best we can do to capture an image of reality.
Yeah, and so one of the biggest, and Dan, I'll let you go right into this. One of the biggest tasks that we've ever seen for that has been the census. As capturing. So, I'd love to hear some more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So the census today, many of you, again, if you, United States and you complete the census in 2020, you would have been amongst the first generation of people to do this on scale online. Before that, people were mainly doing it by mail. And before that, up until about 1950, the census would have always been a person-to-person interaction. Okay. So the Census Bureau would send out enumerators And when you just say it like that, we're going to send out enumerators to go and count people. You're like, okay, yeah, sure. That sounds like a common bureaucratic thing. But then when you really start to think about what this means, it means that the goal always was to count every single American. So in 1940, that would be, oh, good heavens, I think 170. Really long enough now that I've forgotten.
He's got he brought the book out. Look at that.
There we go.
Shameless plug right there. I love it.
Exactly.
Very subtle.
Which, by the way,
this would be
as you know,
very useful way to get this book.
In the book, and the audio version is just as good as reading it, except of course, reading it you get some of the more intricacies of it.
You get the graphs and the math.
And so, as you're doing that, I'd like to know when the census officially started, and we're talking about enumerators. So survey people that are going out to people's homes all the way through the 50s. And you're saying the 2020 version was completely online. Was the 2010 online at all?
No. There was some experiments in 2010.
Okay.
But it really only happens in 2020. And of course, they began this whole process not knowing that we were right in the midst of the account about to have a global pandemic, which made the fact that this was online significantly better, right? Because you can imagine the difficulty of trying to get people to open the door, knocking in the midst of March 2020 would not have been it was not. It was a very difficult operation. And it's really, the census has been delayed as a result of the pandemic in 2020. Yep. And it's just a testament to the incredible work of the Census Bureau that they were able to kind of get this thing to work.
Yeah, and I know you told that story
the first
in the
census.
book. All right, what was it, 1940?
Oh, in 1940, we're talking about 131 million people.
Okay.
So the goal is to count those 131 million people basically all in April. Now, they never do this, in fact. It takes a number of months, like maybe 6 months. Mm-hmm. But that's over the entire extent of the United States. And they're sending out about 120,000 enumerators to go and find and basically touch all of these people.
Yeah.
So it is short of a war, it is the largest mobilization of people that you see a nation take, attempt at any given time.
I did not
And
realize
this happens every 10 years.
Yeah. And so what the first real attempt, what year would that have been? Like, I know 1940 is part of your book and there's a reason for that, but when was like the first real attempt?
Yeah, the very first US census in 1790. And that's immediately after the United States comes into existence.
Oh, wow.
And that's because the census is required by the US Constitution. Once the United States becomes a political entity, it's required to do the census. And the fundamental reason we have the census is because the Constitution requires that each state's representation in the House of Representatives and its representation in the Electoral College, which chooses the president, that should be proportional to its population. Mm-hmm. And so in order to make that work, you need a hopefully accurate count of the number of people in each state. And thus, because of that constitutional requirement, from the very beginning, the United States started this process of every 10 years counting its people. And this was a revolutionary thing at the time. People often resisted being counted or having the censuses take place because they very reasonably and correctly thought, if you count us, you're probably going to try to either tax us or make us fight for you in a war, which indeed is one of the things that one wants to do with these numbers at the very least. The bargain of the United States at its founding was to say, look, dear fellow residents, people here, submit to being counted. And it's true, we will know things about you, which we can use to govern you. But then you will also gain representation in a new representative form of government. So you allow yourself to be seen by the government, and then the government will, to a greater extent, actually serve you.
Gotcha. So the goal back then was population, and I'm saying population, in other words, so they could identify representation in the U.S. Congress. Was that the only question at that point, or were they getting into demographics at any in any scale, like they were doing in the 40s and now what they're doing today?
So in that very first census in 1790, it was fairly bare bones.
Okay.
But again, the Constitution part here matters. When the Constitution set up the system, it made a series of choices in terms of how apportionment was going to work. And it said that it's the population in each state, but Native Americans, what it calls Indians not taxed, were not to be counted. There would be some Native Americans who would be counted, but most would be excluded from this count. And then it said all other persons, but by which this meant essentially enslaved African Americans, would be counted, but then would only count as 3/5 of people for that final count. And so when the 1790 census went out, it did have an initial breakdown. I believe it essentially had, like, the main demographic breakdown was essentially 5 categories. If I'm doing this by memory, so it might be a little bit off, but there was essentially for men, free white men, and then like kind of younger white men, and then white women, and then free people of color, and then enslaved people. So again, I might be off a little bit, but that's the basic breakdown. So the very first census did have what we would now think of as kind of some limited age breakdowns, and then status and race breakdowns. And that was because of the way the Constitution was set up.
Okay. So you focused on the 1940s, and there was a reason. First, that was recently revealed. And there's this, I actually was listening to an interview you had done in the past, and they said, why do they randomly pick 72 as the number of years? But I'm assuming that's based on lifespan, and they wanted to make sure that if you're they're going to be revealing your information, everybody's kind of gone by then. And so that's probably why it ended up being 72, but it's a 72-year span of when it's counted, 1940s. So that makes it 2012 is when they would have released that information. So that was what you really focused on in that book. Was there another reason, like for the 40s? What was so neat about the 40s that you discovered that may have been there before, or just in general?
So first, I'll just very briefly say about that the 72 years thing.
Yeah.
I also have always wanted it to be about lifespan, and yet the best evidence we have suggests that it's not. That this is one of these weird pieces about it might be vaguely related, but essentially there was a choice that was made, a deal between the Archivist of the United States and the Census Bureau in 1952 about when they were going to release the 1880 census.
Okay.
And because they made that deal in 1952, that was 72 years, and it created a precedent. And once that precedent was set, it became enshrined in law as henceforth what we were going to do. So again, maybe in the deep back, the national subconscious, the idea of life expectancy was shaping that decision. Yeah. But it was not formally what led to it.
So it had nothing to do with it. It was just 1952 minus 1880, and there you go. But we all can think that there was rationale behind it, for sure.
Exactly.
So,
yes.
Well, thank you for that
describe
correction.
a story to it.
That's so interesting. So, anyways, in diving into what you had to,
Yeah, so 1940, I was initially drawn to it because this was not only the most recent data set that had been opened, right? So we already right now have from 2020 tables that are being produced that tell us the number of people in each state, the number of people at different demographic and different geographical levels. So those statistical tables come out immediately. But as you said, the Census Bureau is very strict about holding confidential individual people's records. And I hope we'll talk a little bit about why that's so important at some point here. But in 2012, the 1940 records became available. And so that's useful for historians. It's really useful and often used by people who do their family history, by people who do ancestral explorations, people who are on ancestry.com, that sort of thing. And so part of what I was interested in was how we can think about what people who do statistical stuff, what people who identify as doing data stuff are doing, how that's kind of similar to the work of all these people who do their own family histories. And part of what I want to do is try to convince these worlds that, again, feel like they're divergent or split, the like humanistic people concerned about their family stories and social scientists concerned about hard numbers, and try to get us to really realize we're in the same conversation.
Yeah.
And then 1940 turned out to be momentous, consequential for a number of reasons when you start thinking about the census, in part because every census has some of these moments. And it's like, so what's happening in this one? In 1940, we're seeing part of this really significant transition we can get into, where that process of political apportionment becomes automatic. Think of this as like the deep history of automatic decision making, of AI in public life.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that happens is this. There's no way to think about it except like the bending of the statistical system by war, by World War II, and the way in which that creates these incredible pressures on the statistical system, which leads to some significant tragedies, which leads to some really weird ways in which the Census Bureau operates. And so it gives us an opportunity to kind of think about that. And I guess the third thing we can think about is that there's an attempt to, for the first time, investigate people's incomes on the census, and like a mass movement response against what's then deemed an invasion of privacy.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, again, it goes to the same thing with data all the time, which is you want to capture data, but you also don't want to make it too intrusive where nobody's willing to be part of something. Companies get that all the time. Obviously, any survey we do gets that. And of course, the census, the same thing back as early as the 40s. I didn't, until I read your book, I didn't realize that was either the earliest we did it or the late, surprising to me that was the 40s when that really had started and how controversial it was. I love that you talked about the human side and then the data folks. So I'll put myself in the data side. Again, I love these numbers. I could tell you everything about every zip code in Nashville in terms of either ACS data or specifically population numbers, or even like a lot of the CDC data that you can get. So this is stuff that I'm very intimately involved in. But what's interesting is also the human stories behind either the collection of data or things that you saw. So tell us that intersection. What were some really interesting nuggets that you saw or stories from investigating all of that?
And there's so many. How about I'll give you a story about, since this is a podcast for data people, I'll give you a story about some other data people, right? A lot of the stories I end up encountering are stories about data people. So one of the people who first got me into this whole mess, we'll call it, was a scientist, a researcher named Alberti Foudray. Okay. So Foudray was born in, I want to say like 1878. And she went... Well, she got her graduate degree from the University of Michigan, so that's okay. Or she went there for graduate school. I think she actually didn't end up finishing her degree, but she worked there with one of the most influential academic actuary of the early 20th century, a guy named James Glover. And Glover got her a gig, sent her to Washington, D.C. in the early 20th century, where her job was going to be to essentially comb through registration data about births and deaths and that sort of thing, try to figure out where it was good and reliable, because it wasn't reliable from all states yet. It's not really until the middle of the 20th century we start to get really reliable registration data, and you can kind of guarantee people will have a birth certificate. And then she would take all of that, pull it together, and try to create a life table, more like that, something predicting how many people will be alive at any given age throughout for the entire U.S. population. And so she became, in the Census Bureau, the chief person responsible for producing those life tables throughout the early 20th century. She quickly becomes the most sophisticated mathematician and data person in the Census Bureau. And she spends a lot of the 20s in this kind of complicated and morally complicated, at least for me, problem in which her job working under kind of a congressional mandate is to try to determine the racial composition, where race is not just the the 5 census races as we think of them now, but races like white folk are broken up into lots of different races as well, considering the racial composition of the entire United States, with a goal of using that to create justify this very complicated immigration restriction system that's happening in the 1920s. She gets deeply involved in that. The Census Bureau sends her off to Johns Hopkins to be the first person in the Census Bureau to learn about multiple correlation, which is a new technique that's just being introduced.
Wow.
And then she, whenever a major demographic population scientist shows up in Washington, D.C., they end up saying, I just need to go see Miss Foudray first to talk with her a little bit about how the census data is working. So she was this character who I'd never heard of before, but who kept showing up in all of these other records as I was trying to understand the history of population predictions. And I thought, who is this woman scientist who seems to be really at the center of everything, the most sophisticated scientist in the Census Bureau? And like, what's her story? I mean, and in part, you can view it as partly a story about unfairness, because she never gets beyond like an assistant level, despite having all these responsibilities. In the 1940, they hire some guy to be her boss, even though she will then have to train him to do all of the work that she's been doing for all this time. Yeah. And so that's part sad. And yet she also does succeed in this against these odds of being a woman in this as researcher at this point. And so there's something also exciting and really interesting about like thinking about her role and how central a role she played in this important government system.
Yeah, there's a lot of BA people back in the day that wouldn't take no for an answer. That's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I in the same. And I love the people part of this, and I got kind of infatuated with the idea of the enumerator. Give us a feel for what that person, who they were, were these like government officials full-time, or were they just hired like Santa Claus was during, the holiday season? So what was it? Because these are people that are making major interpretations of data that change policy. What does an enumerator look like?
Enumerators are ordinary people for the most part.
Okay.
You need to hire a lot of them. Like I said, in 1940, there was 120,000.
Yeah.
That means, and this is still true today, if you have a really booming economy, or if you have other sorts of things going on, it can be actually quite difficult to get enough enumerators. So 1920, for instance, had a very tough time and had a long delayed census, in part because after the war, right, after World War I, so many people had been off fighting. And then there was also a global pandemic at that point, and which is very difficult to find people to be enumerators in 1920. And that proved to be like a really serious problem. In 1940, they were in the midst of the Depression, 1939, early 1940, when the census began. So not a problem to hire people. In fact, quite the opposite. I see in my records all of these people that are just begging for these enumeration jobs. And they could come from all walks of life. In the 1940 census, about half were men, about half were women.
Okay.
And of the women, about a quarter of the enumerators identified as housewives in terms of like in the census. And many others are becoming as teachers. Teachers were often employed. Lots of people who, male or female, were salespeople because they kind of know how to move in and out. But for the Census Bureau, part of what's so interesting is thinking about like how they're selecting these people. There's kind of two pressures. There's political forces and there's competence and attempts to like quality control. And so on the political side, the party in power, in this case was the Democrats were in power in 1940, they had control of picking the like people a little bit higher on the org chart, who then would go and be responsible for actually hiring all of these enumerators. And they then had some interest in trying to hire people who were more likely to vote for their guy. Yeah. So there was a little bit of selection there for like, we're going to try and find people who either might vote for a guy, or at least who will know that the reason they have this job they want is because of our guy. So there's a patronage aspect to it. On the other side, these people, these Congress people, know that they only get to keep their seats if they get everybody counted effectively. So they want to get people who are going to diligently do their jobs, go out there and find everybody. And then the Census Bureau introduced a series of tests and other mechanisms to try to also both train all of these people to get them to answer questions the way they should, and to weed out those who really can't do anything. And looking at those tests, my favorite moment was there was this test, and it's like you're going through it, and a lot of it's clearly just about making sure that the person who's doing this can follow instructions, that your enumerator can follow instructions and answer things the way the Census Bureau wants them to ask. And it's kind of disheartening. You're like, oh, this job feels just really, stultifying. And then you get to the very end, and there's this free response question. Then they say what do you do if somebody refuses to answer a question? What would you do?
Nice.
And they have to answer it, write it all out. I'm like, oh, good. This is going to be really interesting. And so I'm looking at this, and then I look and I find the answer key.
Mm-hmm.
And for that question, all it says in terms of the answer key is record if the handwriting is legible. Nothing else about the answer. They don't actually care what you're going to do, how you answer this thing. All they're doing is they want you to write out a bunch of stuff to see if your handwriting appears to be legible. Because what they most are concerned about is when you fill out this paper form, are we going to be able to read it?
That makes sense. Oh. Yeah. Can a 7, is it a 7 or is it a 1? And and all of that. So Charlie, I keep hogging things up, and I know that you have a lot of questions as well.
I have a fair amount.
You have a fair amount.
Yeah. So. Well, I wanted to jump in on that story because I knew the answer to the question, because it you talk about it in the book briefly, and it makes a lot of sense. I had no idea that the Census Bureau had a scientific research approach to collecting the data and stuff. I just wouldn't have thought it had been that mature back in the day, or that early on, because, and I guess this leads to, well, I'm trying to decide which one to ask first. So I'll go with something that's kind of based off the analogy you brought up earlier. So you're talking about standing at a doorstep, what is data? And I like that analogy for more than one reason, because it's the amount of data. If you think about the data being generated at the time, it could fit through a door. Now, it would need to be a thoroughfare or something much larger. So as I'll call I think what you've been doing is something I like to call data archaeology. It's just it's a silly term, but it's you're realistically looking into the past and building a picture of the past, and all of these stories, which your book was very Dan Carlin esque in that you were building interesting stories and interactions that tied me to something that I would otherwise not be as interested in, if that makes sense. Go ahead and you can plug your website if you'd like real quick.
He likes the name of your website.
Yeah, I do. Well, I do too. Clearly, that's why I chose it, even though it's a terrible SEO. So it's called www.shroudedincloaksofboringness.com.
Exactly. And so I feel it's very appropriate. But my question is, all of that set up to my question, with all of the new types of data that we're generating, is there, from a Census Bureau perspective, do you believe that there's a reason for them to catalog data that is shared on the internet for posterity's sake? And if so, or either way, how do you think that your job in 72 years, the job you've been doing, will change? And what kind of pictures do you think that you'll be painting? Because in one part of the book, you reference one letter that talks about how one person really feels about another. And in 72 years, you'll have thousands of emails from all different types of people. We'll be able to paint a much clearer picture of who we were in posterity. Did we actually do all that kind of stuff? And so how do you think that that's going, how will that change your approach? I just talked a whole bunch, and
There's a question in there somewhere.
No,
Actually, it was I think a
questions.
very, very interesting point is data is so different today and continues to evolve. Even what the heck's it going to look like in 72 years? I know that we've had these conversations just as we're preparing for this. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Dan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I hope we'll circle back to, and because there's another kind of related question, which is essentially like, how do looking at these things back then shape our sense of what data is today? And I hope we can talk about that.
Yeah, sure.
But
this is something this question is one that I think a lot about.
Mm-hmm.
The census in 2010, 2020 is digital. It's born digital. Mm-hmm. Or even when it's put on paper, it's then scanned in and it's a digital record kept. There are no paper or microfilm records being kept for these recent censuses.
Mm-hmm.
And we have this vision, the sense that, the future is going to be full of so many records. And in fact, that's actually a lot like the 20th century. Like 20th century historians already have this enormous difficulty of there actually being already way too many records for us to constantly work through.
Yeah.
Because once people could type and like mimeograph things, and you start having state-run archives, we just have so many records that like the people who are doing 20th century history have just, are already at just the tip of the iceberg. Okay. Telling the story about the census, for the 1940 alone, like one division of the Census Bureau itself would often have like 14 gigantic archival boxes. And then there's many, many different divisions, right? So like for me to do the story already, I'm like just barely able to touch the tips of what's happening here. So it could be, that we're in the future going to face the same problem to an even greater degree. There's a slightly more troubling possible future, which is that we might actually have a lot less material if it depends on how sanguine we are about the efforts at digital preservation.
Mm-hmm.
Like the question is, how good will we be at finding mechanisms to make sure that digital records produced in 1998 are still legible in 2098?
Yeah.
Thinking about like, I have papers that I wrote in high school or college on Nicest Writer, which was like a word processor that I thought was really cool at that time. And I'm sure that it's entirely impossible to read these things these days, right? And or I've got, stuff on zip disks that who knows if that would ever be, I'd have to like find somebody with a zip drive somewhere that was still functioning their archivists are working on this stuff. And so if we have faith in the government and we know they're working on this, then probably the census records will still exist 100 years from now. Mm-hmm. I hope that they will.
Yeah.
But I get a little bit nervous about it just because I don't understand that system.
Now you've made me a little bit more scared because I would have assumed it was something they had under wraps.
No, we assume that everything's being perfectly cataloged today and it's living on a digital shelf, and that's just not true. It's like you've got a messy room of a bunch of data and we just keep piling more into it and we think that means it's organized. And I think that's what you're really getting to. And it's in weird shapes, files, formats. And in the past, it was a piece of paper. Everybody could see that piece of paper. In 50 years, that .docx file or that .pdf, is that still a thing? Or do we have to figure out ways to convert it? And then where the heck was it in the first place? No, I've never thought of that. I mean, to me, this is, you're right. It is a little bit on the scary side, but also you think about, we are digitally cataloging ourselves every day. And it's so different.
And the Census Bureau is the best case, probably, because indeed, the Census Bureau working with the National Archives, you've got whole teams of professionals funded by a government and a state, and their responsibility, because they're working for the government and working for the people, is to actually make sure that every single person's record is faithfully kept, mm-hmm. that it's preserved in confidentiality, not misused, and then will be available in the future. Whereas, like, if you want to figure out, like, what is Meta going to do with our data?
Oh,
I mean, right. Not only might we be concerned very reasonably about how those records might be being used today to shape our lives, but again, if our premise is that all the ways in which we're recording our lives daily are going to be available to us 100 years from now, that's putting a lot of faith in the idea that a company whose like goal is to sell ads today is going to spend any amount of time and energy preserving our records in a usable format for 100 years from the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I doubt it. I'm more like, again, I don't have any evidence for this. This is all like simple prognostication, but I'm more likely to think that we're like on the verge of a digital dark age in terms of records than that we're about to spin off into a future of full information awareness.
Really?
Because I just don't see that there's an incentive for that kind of preservation.
Well, so that's a good point, but there's also new territory that we'll be traveling as well, because we've never been able to hold on to these types of like accurate digital representations of ourselves. And so if an Ancestry.com finds out that buying people's metadata in posterity is advantageous, then we very well could. I like to think, like, I'm more of an optimist in this particular category, because I like to think that the people connected to the internet will save as much as possible. It's like the Streisand effect. If you try to get rid of something on the internet, it just makes it worse. And so that's kind of the premise that I'm going on. And I'm also going on the premise that at some point, some hack event is going to open up a lot of people's general data, which is just, it's inevitable if we keep going the way we're going.
Yeah. I mean, so I think that seems like a great moment to talk about one of the other things that I learned doing this book, that was really kind of crystallized for me doing this book, was thinking about the relationship between records that represent individuals and statistical compilations.
Okay.
Right. And so like, and we often think about this then in terms of confidentiality or privacy as the thing which holds those two things apart. And I guess, one of the reasons we often say, well, you want confidentiality or privacy is because people won't answer questions if they think what their answers are going to get out and cause them trouble in the future. And so to get good data, you want to make sure you have good privacy. And I think there's another really good reason, having done this research. When you spend a lot of time with census records and you start looking at how people respond to them, when you look at how companies respond, when you look at what the Census Bureau expects, it turns out like these people who are building these data sets don't expect that they're getting a perfect representation or something that's fully accurate. They know that they're dealing with enumerators who are not perfectly trained. They know that the categories that they're rolling out are often not quite fine-grained enough to actually fit the experiences of all the people that live in this wide, woolly world. Yeah. And like but for businesses, it's even more interesting, because oftentimes they're asking for business data that the business wouldn't have had time to actually have formally calculated yet, because the end of the fiscal year is going to be different than the census year. And so the Census Bureau is saying, well, just give us an estimate of what do you think these numbers are going to be. And so one of the reasons why you want to have this kind of split between individual records and statistical records is because if you get a whole bunch of individual records that are not perfect and you put them all together, thanks to the law of large numbers, bam, we've got good statistics, or pretty reliable statistics, can tell something interesting about the world. But each of those records is actually not a good representation of the individual. And so we want to preserve confidentiality and privacy, in part just because like those records were not meant to represent people in the real world. They were meant to build statistics.
Yeah, that is such a good point. Over and over again, I have to tell people when I'm looking at ACS data or the census data, it's good enough for what we're using it for. And I'm not drilling down to an individual. So when it says a certain number, that's not the number. That is an estimate for a population or a sample. And we're using it as basically a paintbrush to tell us about that area. And that's a hard thing for people to connect to. And I think you did that very well. We are literally collecting data to create statistics. And, including, when we're looking, when I'm looking at healthcare related data, especially if it's CDC related, CDC Places is a perfect example. That data is just phenomenal. But when it says 47% of the people have hypertension, well, it's not 47%. But that 47% is higher than 18%. And I feel pretty good that 18% is not going to be so wrong in our calculations that it's actually higher than that 47. So it allows us to see what we want to see. And I think that's really, really important to make that distinction. And, just like with income now, I mean, it could really go into sampling, right? And now they use sampling to look at things. And so explain how sampling is now used. That wasn't used in the 40s, correct?
So the 1940, that's one of the other things that's important about 1940. This is the first time that the census itself starts to use some amount of sampling.
Okay.
And so the very first use of sampling by the federal government is, I think, in 1937 in a survey meant to try to gauge unemployment. Again, it's the middle of the Depression. Yeah. This is a contentious political question. The Census Bureau employs in 1940 not as a tool of trying to decrease the size of the census, but essentially as a way of trying to cheat the system. Like they filled up this entire gigantic piece of paper with questions. And Congress is like, but we got a couple more things we want. Or like, and other experts are like, there's a few other questions we really want to know. And so like, all right, fine. Every, on each side of the sheet of paper, each of which has, let's see if I can show folks a picture of this. This is the front of the book.
Oh, there we go.
So it's this, but
and so for those at home, we're looking at what a real page. Now that's what the enumerator would be looking at.
This is what the enumerator was holding in a gigantic portfolio the size of a newspaper, and it would have on each side 40 rows, and then 30 some columns of data that would be filled in for each person in those 40 rows. And then on each of those sides, there's 2 of the rows that have been highlighted, that have been darkened. And those are the sample rows. And a person who randomly falls in that sample row then is asked a series of other questions that show up at the very bottom of that sheet.
Gotcha.
So this is a 5% sample intended to then supplement the existing count. Okay. Once they figure out how to do this, though, both statisticians and government start to realize, this could turn around the other direction as well. And especially increasingly because both people don't want to spend time answering these questions, and because of privacy concerns, like people don't want to give up all of this information, especially as the government is asking about more and more things that people might deem to be personal information. There's a real incentive to ask fewer people more questions. And so the decennial census every 10 years, its primary purpose is to do that complete and total count with some very basic demographic figures, because you need to know, this is what we call the sample frame. You need to know at a basic level who everybody is and where they are. And once you have that basic framework, then you can pick out people according to the characteristics you're interested in and ask a small sample of those people a lot more questions and weight those results according to what the sample frame tells us. And from that, make these fairly accurate estimates of what it is for the entire population. So the sampling is possible, and it's experimented first in the census. But the key thing about the census is that this decennial, every 10-year census is necessary as the foundational layer upon which all this other data work builds.
Yeah, and so is that the American Consumer Survey today? Is that sampling? And so when I say ACS data, I'm referring to the American Consumer Survey, and it's actually a 5-year rolling data collection. So they're collecting data over a 5-year span for that data. And I have to tell this to people because what they want to do is compare 2017 to 2018 to 2019. I'm like, actually, it's the same data in a lot of cases because they're going. And I know we get into the ACS data a lot, but you have the census data every 10 years, and then you can feel comfortable when it says 2020 ACS that's 2020, but it's also actually all the way through 2015 up to that time frame because they're not going and doing the mad mobilization like they do with the U.S. Census for the ACS data. And so they publish that every year, but it's only incrementally different than it was before. And that gets into more of the more defined questions. And so today the U.S. Census is how many questions? I mean, or compare to what it was in the 40s.
Yeah. So in the 40s, like I say, you'd have about 30 columns worth of questions.
Yes.
What those questions are change over time, and that reflects what's politically contentious at any given time. Like, you can read a census record as a way of trying to understand what were people fighting about, what were they interested in, what were they concerned about. In the early 20th century, Congress is like deeply debating whether or not to limit immigration, and eventually will. But as a result, throughout those early censuses, the records are covered with people talking about where were you born, where was your mom born, where was your dad born, what were their languages. Much of the record is those things that are going to be part of this question about immigration. In 1940, suddenly it changes, and about half to more of the sheets is talking about migration within the United States and economic questions. And so as a result of that concern about the Depression, suddenly the census changes, and because it's after immigration restrictions, so like that record changes. As we move later in the 20th century, much of those, the form shifts down, and we start to shed a lot of those questions. At first, they are administered every 10 years on what's called the long form. Mm-hmm. And then in around 2000 or so, that long form goes away, and instead the American Community Survey that you were talking about takes its place as a 1% to 2% sample of the entire population. With the advantage, it's a much smaller sample, but because you can change it every year, you can add some questions in and out every year, it becomes a much more kind of nimble data set than what preceded it. But now you answer about 10 questions on the census.
Down to 10 questions. Yeah, that's a big difference. Charlie, I'm looking at your notes, and you have a lot on bias and the flaws in the data collection. I don't know if you wanted to hit up on that a little bit, if that was something you were curious about.
Yeah, so a bunch of the stories that you talk about are people in the margins. What does and this was relevant for me as far as like my approach is like, what is the data not saying, and what does that say about the data? And so what intrigues you the most about that, and making sure that that biases are found, spotlighted, shown, or I don't know. It feels like you're going from like painting a picture of what the data says to also filling in the blanks with like the lesser known stats in the data. And like, but why do that? I guess that's what I'm getting at. It's like, what's important about that to you?
Yeah. So one example is one of the things that got me kind of moving in this project was a colleague who was also a historian and was working in some records, came across a pair of people living together. One of them was listed as the head of household, and the next person was listed as partner to that person in 1940. And she said, Dan, what's up with this? And I said, I don't know. I was early on in the project. I hadn't spent that much time. And so I started to dig in a little bit further. And you use this term, the margins. Like one of my kind of hypotheses was like, all right, so maybe partner could mean a business partner. Partner could mean someone who you just share a place with. But we also now use partner so often as a kind of term of it's kind of someone you live romantically with or have an intimate relationship with. And so I thought, well, is this what this is? It's like, are we seeing kind of queer communities forming in the census in a way that was not an acceptable way to talk about it in 1940? And so I've said, I haven't encountered these partners in my records generally. I'll go looking for some needles, right? And at this point, I couldn't search. Now you can kind of search for this on Ancestry, but I couldn't at that point. And so I said, well, I'll look in places that I know from other histories where queer neighborhoods, where gay neighborhoods where lesbians were living, from other histories, and see what happens. And so I would look in Greenwich Village and look in Harlem and look on the Upper East Side in New York and started looking in San Francisco and some other places. And sure enough, I started to find more and more partners. Now, what's interesting about that is like, I thought, well, all right. So the next thing I did was I started looking at maps that were produced by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s. So these are maps tied to what we often talk about as redlining.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially what they are is they're a record of how bankers and real estate people saw neighborhoods, whether or not they believe those neighborhoods to be high risk or low risk. And their judgment has a lot to do with race and class. It has a lot to do with the state of investment in an area. But so it's kind of a way of like figuring out any place that is red or yellow, that is a C or a D rating, both had a lot more trouble getting loans in many cases. And it's how elites saw an area to be marginal. Yeah. And what I found was those areas were more likely to have these people labeled as partners.
Okay.
So it could kind of tell us something about like people in intimate relationships. But I think it also told us about people who just didn't quite have the same elite resources. The place where I found the most partners was actually not in the United States as they then consisted as the formal states, but in one of the colonies, one of the territories, Hawaii, which is not yet a state, had by far the most partners of all. And that's because these partners were mostly Filipino men living and working in Hawaii on sugar plantations. And they would live together in big camps, and partner was a term by which they could kind of be put together. And so what do I do when I learn about this? Well, one, it just suddenly shows me that the partner as a label in this raw data opens up all these interesting questions about like what it was like to live within this system. Yeah. And how, like, both what the norm was, what the expectation of the people who made the data was, and then what all these different ways of living were that didn't quite fit those norms. And that itself is interesting to me, right? Like my ethos in this project is one that everybody's story counts. And I'm interested in honoring each of those stories, and the people who kind of break the norms become interesting in part just because they give us a sense of like what was possible, what are the different borders and extents to which it was possible to live at any given moment. The other thing it does, taking us back to that earlier thing we were talking about, is it also just is a good reminder of the limits of the ultimate printed data, right? Because in the end, what I learned from the partner label is still something of a mystery. And those partners don't even exist in the printed tables. So like, even when I get to those fundamental records, they don't really tell me what was happening in any of these households. They just tell me something interesting was there. Yeah. And that is both a useful thing for like holding down our expectations for what data can do for us, and also an invitation to dream and think and kind of make stories and like allow our imaginations to go and be like, what was happening in this household? I find it like, it's just fun to think with and dream with.
I liked, you were talking about being a part of the stories and stuff like that. And I like to think when you were going through your name section and the importance of a name, you were very clearly stating people's names, like the name of the person, the name of the enumerator, the name of this person and that. And I thought that like, that's kind of the cool part about data is you can take an action that they probably never would have thought would have been talked about again. And you talked about it in your book, and now we're talking on a podcast. And so your actions can live on in these kind of subtle ways. And I like that, about the storytelling piece.
Yeah. And I love a lot of the stuff that we've gone to here. And we've kept you already, in a long time here, but I do want to get to what you're doing in the future, because I think, I'm assuming your story hasn't come to a complete stop yet, right? But also, you do a great job in your book about talking about where those flaws are and give suggestions. Are we a lot better today in counting partners for the LGBTQ population, for races? I had somebody just a couple of days ago, we were talking about this. We were looking at management roles for Black or African American compared to white. But she was Hispanic, and she's like, am I a race according to the census? And I'm like, I don't even know, because it's a separate question, right? Why?
So,
yes,
not right now, but that is a very apt question for exactly this moment. The Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, is in the process of reviewing its central directive, which is the mechanism, one of these directives by which it tells the rest of the government how it should administer questions about race and administer questions about race, so that then it can think about the differential experiences and try to then make policy that can try to make those experiences more equitable. And that's going to be tied now to what's going to happen in the next census. And one of the questions that was just put out there was essentially, should this current two-part question be collapsed into one? So currently now there's a question in which one is asked if they are have a Hispanic or not ethnicity. And then after that comes a question about what race, which races or races they identify with. And that's a check as many boxes as possible thing. And we can't even get into all of the complicated implications of both of these sets of questions, but one of the suggestions now is to bring them together, making Latinx or Latino or Hispanic a racial category, and also adding a Middle Eastern, North African category, MENA, and then also allowing with that still people to check more boxes. That one of the interesting things I experienced kind of talking with people who are like use this data, and also people who use it for trying to advocate for their communities, is that even though an individual, again, to represent themselves fully, might really want to check multiple boxes, sometimes activists or advocates encourage people to pick a community, because what they know is that once you check multiple boxes, because of the way in which the aggregation systems work, and because of our concern about like printing data at large enough numbers, more often than not, then there ends up being a kind of like 2 or more boxes category, by which people who have checked more than one racial box are essentially erased into that one umbrella category.
Yeah.
They're the other in that case.
And then the primary individual boxes like lose those people as well. And so I talked to like one of my favorite friends was talking about how she could identify as South Asian or as African American, and she identifies as African American because she wants to appear in one of the columns, and she knows that she wouldn't in many of these boxes otherwise. And so there are interesting ways in which you kind of have to know how the data system works, and it again just re-emphasizes that like the individual records we're making here are not really meant to represent individuals. They're part of our process to figure out how to best understand the entire population.
Yeah.
That was that actually answered another question that I had about is there, as far as like input and stuff goes in the choosing process, is there still like inherent biases in the application of it? And so I would say yes in that case.
Sure. I mean, what do I choose? My ethnicity is Armenian. I'm probably, if there was a Middle Eastern one, I would pick that one, but would I? And I'm definitely not the same as an Irish person or an English person in terms of, just background. And so somebody asked me that question last week, what would you actually choose? And I'm like, I have to choose white, and I don't feel that way, and so that right there is biased. It automatically is putting me in a category that I'm not even comfortable with, but I have no choice, because that's what is being, that's the combo box. When I got to select one and I don't fit the others, so I fit this one ish. And so I think there's a lot to that. And I know that we're never going to capture perfect data. But I'm glad to hear that they're actually looking to make it more equitable. And it always goes back to, what's the goal? Like, why are you collecting race? Why are you? Is there a reason? And if the reason is just to see things, that's different than, okay, it's because certain allocations, or we can help certain communities better. We can identify, again, we see certain things in the data all the time. It's not race, it's opportunity. But because of your race, there's less opportunities, and so data is a proxy for opportunity a lot of times. So it is important to see that. I just think it's incredibly fascinating to think through that for sure. All right. Well, I just want to know, Dan, what are you planning to do next other than get ready for classes in the fall, right? Is there another book on the way, or are you diving more into the census?
So, probably the census will never leave me behind now because it keeps coming back every 10 years. And I've got this wonderful community of census advocates who often have historical questions that I'm really glad to answer. But I do have a new project in the very earliest stages. But I'm continuing to look for really, really boring things that I think are really important that we need to understand. And so I'm turning to budgets. And in particular, I want to look at the New York City budget.
Oh, yeah.
And try to understand how one of the biggest cities in the United States, which spends, all of these billions of dollars. And where we often have this question, like, having spent all this money, what do we get for it? Mm-hmm. I want to kind of try to explore that question over time and think about what it means to create a budget, how it works. And ultimately, by doing that kind of deep historical work, one, make it more clear for people who might decide they want to try to make this whole system work better for all New Yorkers and for people who live in cities everywhere.
Yeah. And
at the same time, also just kind of get to this question, can this thing be changed, right? It's like such an incredible and complex apparatus. If someone did want to try to make this budget work differently, how would you do that? And I think history can be a way to start to try to get into that question.
To ease some of the pain of change.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to show transparency, which might build trust within the New York residents and community. I see that I spent a lot of time with our city government, and we just went through, and our budget was just approved here in the last few weeks, and that was approved for a budget for a mayor that is gone in 3 months because he's not running again. But he's the one, so whoever the new mayor is now has to, for 1 year, use the budget from the past person and how deals are made and everything. And Nashville is so small compared to New York. At first I'm like, boy, how are you going to make that sound interesting? But now I'm like, when that book comes out, I'm going to be very interested, especially now that I've been so involved with the Nashville community. There's a lot to that. And that will be interesting. I think that's going to be monumental on your side. But I wish you well on that one.
We'll see.
Yeah. Charlie, go ahead.
I would be really excited to read that because I find that to be relevant.
Well, I like that.
Right? Yeah, it's...
All right. Well, this is the part where I look at Charlie and say, Charlie, any final thoughts before we throw it to our gracious guest today?
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Dan, for hopping on and being patient and stuff. I do feel like there was lots of theoretical kind of philosophical conversations that we could have had about data and who owns it and how to wield it responsibly. So we've got fodder for the future. And then maybe if you're ever in Nashville, you can come in and see what the studio looks like.
Well,
I hear it's nice.
Well, you have two personal concierge folks here for you. If you ever were in town, we owe you that for sure. Dan, any final thoughts?
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you to your listeners. If you've made it this long in this podcast or on this video, bravo.
No, we're right there with you. Bravo for sure.
Well, you would be surprised how many people love the census data and publicly available data. And you say that, but there you go. And democracy's data is the way to start by our gracious guest, and I'm getting a little bit Dan, and then I'm going to say it's Bouk. Bouk.
Yeah.
Did I say it right?
Amazing.
I did.
Bouk.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he said it correctly. That's why initially, and I was like, I think I'm going to say it the correct way, but
I just learned yesterday that I've been saying you. So I know his brother, and so I've been saying to his face Bouk this entire time, and I've only ever said Bouk.
I'm sure he never corrected you. We never
not.
correct anybody because it's a losing battle.
Have the last name Apigian, and let's see how that goes. You'll get the same thing, but you know, especially, you know, again, I'm working mostly in the healthcare side. Everything's about social determinants of health. And we go back to the census data now. We're using ACS all the time, and we're getting such a better view of the whole person because we're using that type of data. So this is a topic that the data folks in the world, the people that are interested in people's health and well-being, are really interested in. I know we've had people, and there's so much more. The great part is, your book, especially the audiobook, it's like you're having a conversation with people. It goes across that way. So if you want to continue the conversation and get deep into it, I do highly recommend Dan's book, Democracies Data. And with that, I always got to throw it back to Charlie. He knows he's going to make me do this. I can actually grab them this time. How do you like that?
So we normally sit on the opposite ends of the table.
That's right. This is so, you know, everything about today is weird, except on audio, it's going to sound just normal and all of that. So Dan, thank you again for your time today. I just can't thank you for, first of all, your patience in the beginning. We will admit that again. But once we got going, what a great conversation. We really can't thank you enough. So for the Data for All podcast, everybody, please, if you've liked what you've heard today, which I know you have, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and so you can keep hearing all the great stuff. And what people are noticing now is every time I do this, start talking, this is the look that Charlie gives me.
Because like 5 minutes ago, we should have been done.
Oh, wow.
He just can't end it. He's like, and then this. And
I always do the editing part. So with that, Charlie, I'm going to just go straight to it. So, Charlie, anything else?
No, I'm good.
He's good. And so for the Data for All podcast, I'm Charlie Apigian.
And I'm Charlie Yielding.
And until next time.